Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and thank you so much for joining us for this episode. This is the second part of a three-part miniseries on Edward Bulwer-Lytton's The Haunted and the Haunters. If you have not listened to part 1 yet, I would suggest you start there. There are a few other interesting tidbits about Edward Bulwer-Lytton that are well worth sharing. In particular, he wrote arguably two of the most well-known expressions in the English language. The first, which is a favorite for anyone who likes scary stories, it was a dark and stormy night. Surprisingly, it is not from one of his ghost stories. It was the opening line of his novel, Paul Clifford, which tells the story of a young man who starts out life as a criminal and later on becomes a respected member of society. Here's the complete first sentence. It was a dark and stormy night. The rain fell in torrents, except at occasional intervals when it was checked by a violent gust of wind which swept up the streets. For it is in London that our scene lies, rattling along the housetops and fiercely agitating the scanty flame of the lamps that struggled against the darkness. Bulwer-Lytton's other very well-known line is from his play Cardinal Richelieu. The play is set in 17th century France and centers around the character of Cardinal Richelieu, the powerful chief minister to King Louis VIII. When informed of a murder plot against him and asked if he should seek to kill those pursuing him, he responded with, "The pen is mightier than the sword." As you will recall, in part 1 of The Haunted and the Haunters, our unnamed protagonist, his servant, and his dog plan to stay a night inside a house that is rumored to be haunted. When they arrive, the dog starts acting strange, never a good sign. In the backyard, they observe childlike footprints appearing before them, witness furniture moving on its own, and feel unseen hands reach out to touch their shoulders. They eventually get locked into a strange little room with a door that seems to have a mind of its own. When it suddenly opens, they follow a pale light up to the attics. In one of the rooms, they discover a small bundle of letters, and as they leave the room and head back down the stairs to the sound of unseen footsteps, our protagonist feels a ghostly hand try to pull the letters from his grasp. Now, for part 2 of The Haunted and the Haunters. But before we get to that, very quickly, a reminder that as of next weekend, the first weekend in February, we are back to running tours in all 3 cities, Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto. And if you're looking for a fun Valentine's idea, well, we'd love to see you out on tour. If your boo is into slightly more intense experiences, you can join us at the SDG Jail in Cornwall, Ontario on February 10th and 11th for a paranormal investigation with our good friends from Phantoms of Yore. Information about our ghost tours and paranormal investigations can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. Some good news to pass on. We have been nominated for the 2023 Ottawa Awards in the Best Tour category. Now, this is all done by voting, so if you have a moment to vote for us, if you can go to facesmag.ca, as in Faces Magazine, facesmag.ca/awards, and check out the tourism category. You will find us there under Best Tour, and we would love to have your support. If you check out our recent social media posts on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, you can find a direct link to our category. You can vote once a day, so please feel free to vote early and often. Finally, if you are enjoying the show, be sure to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen, and recommend Haunted Talks to friends, family, and random strangers on the internet who have a love of things that go bump in the night. We regained the bedchamber appropriated to myself, and I then remarked that my dog had not followed us when we had left it. He was thrusting himself close to the fire and trembling. I was impatient to examine the letters, and while I read them, my servant opened a little box in which he had deposited the weapons I had ordered him to bring, took them out, placed them on the table close at my bedhead, and then occupied himself in soothing the dog, who, however, seemed to heed him very little. The letters were short. They were dated, the dates exactly 35 years ago. They were evidently from a lover to his mistress, or a husband to some young wife. Not only the terms of expression, but a distinct reference to a former voyage, indicating the writer had been a seafarer. The spelling and handwriting were those of a man imperfectly educated, but still the language itself was forcible. In these expressions of endearment, there was a kind of rough, wild love, but here and there were dark, unintelligible hints at some secret, not of love, some secret that seemed of crime. "We ought to love each other," was one of the sentences I remember. "For how everyone would loathe us if all was known." Another, "Don't let anyone be in the same room with you at night. You talk in your sleep." And again, "What's done can't be undone. And I tell you there's nothing against us unless the dead could come to life." Here, there was underlined in a better handwriting, a female's, "They do." At the end of the letter, latest in date, the same female hand had written these words: "Lost at sea, the 4th of June, the same day as..." I put down the letters and began to muse over their contents. Fearing, however, that the train of thought into which I fell might unsteady my nerves, I fully determined to keep my mind in a fit state to cope with whatever of the marvelous the advancing night might bring forth. I roused myself, laid the letters on the table, stirred up the fire, which was bright and cheering, and opened my volume of Macaulay. I read quietly enough till about 11:30. I then drew myself dressed upon the bed and told my servant he might retire to his own room, but must keep himself awake. I bade him leave open the door between our 2 rooms. Thus alone, I kept 2 candles burning on the table by my bedhead. I placed my watch beside the weapons and calmly resumed my Macaulay. Opposite to me, the fire burned clear, and on the hearthrug, seemingly asleep, lay the dog. In about 20 minutes, I felt an exceedingly cold air pass by my cheek, like a sudden draft. I fancied the door to my right, communicating with the landing place, must have gotten open. But no, it was closed I then turned my glance to the left and saw the flame of the candles violently sway as if by a wind. At the same moment, the watch beside the revolver softly slid from the table. Softly, softly, no visible hand. It was gone. I sprang up, seizing the revolver with the one hand, the dagger with the other. I was not willing that my weapon should share the fate of the watch. Thus armed, I looked around the floor. No sign of the watch. 3 slow, loud, distinct knocks were now heard at the bedhead. My servant called out, "Is that you, sir?" "No. Be on your guard." The dog now roused himself and sat on his haunches, his ears moving quickly backwards and forwards. He kept his eyes fixed on me with a look so strange that he concentrated all of my attention on himself. Slowly he rose up, all his hair bristling, and stood perfectly rigid, and with the same wild stare. I had no time, however, to examine the dog. Presently my servant emerged from his room, and if ever I saw horror in the human face, it was then. I should not have recognized him had we met on the street, so altered was every lineament. He passed by me quickly, saying in a whisper that seemed scarcely to come from his lips, "Run, run, it's after me." He gained the door to the landing, pulling it open, and rushed forth. I followed him into the landing involuntarily, calling him to stop. But without heeding me, he bounded down the stairs, clinging to the balusters, and taking several steps at a time. I heard, where I stood, the street door open, heard it clasp again, and I was left alone in the haunted house. It was but for a moment that I remained undecided whether or not to follow my servant. Pride and curiosity alike forbade so dastardly a flight. I re-entered my room, closing the door after me, and proceeded cautiously into the interior chamber. I encountered nothing to justify my servant's terror. I again carefully examined the walls to see if there were any concealed doors. I could find no trace of one, not even a seam in the dull brown paper with which the room was hung. How then had the thing, whatever it was, which had so scared him, obtained entry except through my own chamber? I returned to my room, shut and locked the door that opened upon the interior one, and stood on the hearth, expectant and prepared. I now perceived that the dog had slunk into an angle of the wall and was pressing himself close against it, as if literally striving to force his way into it. I approached the animal and spoke to it. The poor brute was evidently beside itself with terror. It showed all its teeth, the slobber dropping from its jaw, and would certainly have bitten me if I had touched it. It did not seem to recognize me. Whoever has seen at the zoological gardens a rabbit, fascinated by a serpent cowering in the corner, may have some idea of the anguish which the dog exhibited. Finding all efforts to soothe the animal in vain, and fearing that his bite might be venomous in that state of madness, of hydrophobia, I left him alone, placed my weapons on the table beside the fire, and seated myself, and recommenced my Macaulay. Perhaps, in order not to appear seeking credit for courage, or rather a coolness which my reader may conceive I exaggerate, I may be pardoned if I pause to indulge in one or two egotistical remarks. As I hold presence of mind, or what is called courage, to be precisely proportioned to familiarity with the circumstances that lead to it, so I should say that I had been long sufficiently familiar with all experiments that pertain to the marvelous. I had witnessed many very extraordinary phenomena in various parts of the world. Phenomena that would either be totally disbelieved if I had stated them, or ascribed to supernatural agencies. Now, my theory is that the supernatural is impossible, and that what is called supernatural is only something of the laws of nature of which we have been hitherto ignorant. Therefore, if a ghost rise before me, I have not the right to say, "So then, the supernatural is possible," but rather, "So then, the apparition of a ghost is, contrary to my received opinion, within the laws of nature, that is, not supernatural." Now, in all that I had hitherto witnessed, and indeed in all the wonders which the amateurs of mystery in our age record as facts, a material living agency is always required. On the continent, you will find still magicians who assert they can raise spirits. Assume for the moment that they assert truly. Still, the living material form of the magician is present, and he is the material agency by which some constitutional peculiarities, certain strange phenomena, are represented to your natural senses. Accept again as truthful the tales of spirit manifestation in America. Musical or other sounds, writings on paper produced by no discernible hand, articles of furniture moved without apparent human agency, or the actual sight and touch of hands to which no bodies seem to belong. Still, there must be found the medium, or living being, with constitutional peculiarities capable of obtaining these signs. In fine, in all such marvels, supposing even there is no imposture, there must be a human being like ourselves, by whom, or through whom, the effects presented to human beings are produced. It is so with the now familiar phenomena of mesmerism or electrobiology. The mind of the person operated on is affected through a material living agent. Nor supposing it is true that a mesmerized patient can respond to the will or passes of a mesmerizer 100 miles distant, is the response less occasioned by a material being. It may be through a material fluid, call it electric, call it what you will, which has the power of traversing space and passing obstacles, and the material effect is communicated from one to the other. Hence, all that I have hitherto witnessed, or expected to witness, in this strange house, I believe to be occasioned through some agency or medium as mortal as myself. And this idea necessarily prevented the awe with which those who regard as supernatural things that are not within the ordinary operations of nature might have been impressed by the adventures of this memorable night. As then, it was my conjecture that all that was presented, or would be presented to my senses, must originate in some human being gifted by constitution with the power to present them, and having some motive to do so. I felt an interest in my theory which, in its way, was rather philosophical than superstitious, and I can sincerely say that I was in a tranquil temper for observation as any practical experimentalist could in awaiting the effects of some rare, though perhaps perilous, chemical combination. Of course, the more I kept my mind detached from fancy, the more the temper fitted for observation would be obtained, and I therefore riveted my eye and thought on the strong daylight sense in the page of my Macaulay. I now became aware that something interposed between the page and the light, The page was overshadowed. I looked up, and I saw what I shall find it very difficult, perhaps impossible, to describe. It was a darkness, shaping itself from the air in a very undefined outline. I cannot say if it was a human form, and yet it had more resemblance to a human form, or rather shadow, than to anything else. As it stood wholly apart and distinct from the air and the light around it, its dimensions seemed gigantic, the summit nearly touching the ceiling. While I gazed, a feeling of intense cold seized me. An iceberg before me could not have chilled me more, nor could the cold of an iceberg have been more purely physical. I feel convinced that it was not the cold caused by fear. As I continued to gaze, I thought, but this I cannot say with precision, that I distinguished two eyes looking down at me from the height. One moment I fancied that I distinguished them clearly. The next, they seemed gone. But still, two rays of pale blue light frequently shot through the darkness, as from the height on which I half believed, half doubted, I had encountered the eyes. I strove to speak. My voice utterly failed me. I could only think to myself, is this fear? It is not fear. I strove to rise, in vain. I felt as if weighted down by an irresistible force. Indeed, my impression was that of an immense and overwhelming power opposed to my volition. That sense of utter inadequacy to cope with a force beyond man's, which one may feel physically in a storm at sea, in a conflagration, or when confronting some terrible wild beast, or perhaps the shark in the ocean, I felt morally. Opposed to my will was another will, as far superior to its strength as storm, fire, and shark are superior in material force to the force of man. And now, as this impression grew on me, now came at last horror. Horror to a degree that no words can convey. I still retained pride, if not courage, and in my own mind I said, this is horror, but it is not fear. Unless I fear, I cannot be harmed. My reason rejects this thing. It is an illusion. I do not fear. With a violent effort, I succeeded at last in stretching out my hand toward the weapon on the table. As I did so, on the other arm and shoulder, I received a strange shock, and my arm fell to my side powerless. And now, to add to my horror, the light slowly began to wane from the candles. They were not, as it were, extinguished, but their flame seemed very gradually withdrawn. It was the same with the fire. The light was extracted from the fuel. In a few minutes, the room was in utter darkness. The dread that came over me, to be thus in the dark, with that dark thing, whose power was so intensely felt, brought a reaction of nerve. In fact, terror had reached that climax, that either my senses must have deserted me, or I must have been burst through the spell. I did burst through it. I found my voice, though my voice was a shriek. I remembered that I broke forth with words like these: I do not fear, my soul does not fear. And at the very same time, I found the strength to rise. Still in that profound gloom, I rushed to one of the windows, tore aside the curtain, flung open the shutters. My first thought was light. And when I saw the moon, high, clear, and calm, I felt a joy that almost compensated for the previous terror. There was the moon. There was also the light from the gas lamps in the deserted, slumberous streets. I turned to look back into the room. The moon penetrated its shadow very palely and partially, but still there was light. The dark thing, whatever it might be, was gone. Except I could yet see a dim shadow, which seemed the shadow of that shade against the opposite wall. My eye now rested on the table, and from under the table, which was without cloth or cover, an old mahogany round table, there rose a hand, visible as far as the wrist. It was a hand seemingly as much flesh and blood as my own, but the hand of an aged person, lean, wrinkled, small too, a woman's hand. That hand very softly closed on the two letters that lay on the table. Hands and letters both vanished. There then came the same loud, 3 measured knocks I had heard at the bedhead before this extraordinary drama had commenced. As those sounds slowly ceased, I felt the whole room vibrate sensibly. And at the very far end, there rose, as from the floor, sparks or globules, like bubbles of light, many colored, green, yellow, fire red, azure, up and down, to and fro, hither, thither, as tiny will-o-wisps. The sparks moved, slow or swift, each at its own caprice. A chair, as in the drawing room below, was now advanced from the wall without apparent agency, placed at the opposite side of the table. Suddenly, as forth from the chair, there grew a shape, a woman's shape. It was distinct as a shape of life, ghastly as a shape of death. The face was that of youth, with strange, mournful beauty. The throat and shoulders were bare, the rest of the form in a loose robe of cloudy white. It began sleeking its long yellow hair, which fell over its shoulders. Its eyes were not turned towards me, but to the door. It seemed listening, watching, waiting. The shadow of that shade in the background grew darker, and again I thought I beheld the eyes gleaming out from that summit of the shadow, eyes fixed upon that shape. As if from the door, though it did not open, these grew out another shape, equally distant, equally ghastly. A man's shape, a young man's. It was in the dress of the last century, or rather in likeness of such dress, for both the male shape and the female, though defined, were evidently unsubstantial, impalpable, simulacra, phantasms. And there was something incongruous, grotesque, yet fearful in the contrast between the elaborate finery, the courtly precision of that old-fashioned garb, with its ruffles and lace and buckles, and the corpse-like aspect and ghost-like stillness of the fitting wearer. Just as the male shape approached the female, the dark shadow started from the wall. All three for a moment wrapped in darkness. When the pale light returned, the two phantoms were as if in the grasp of the shadow that towered between them. And there was a blood stain on the breast of the female, and the phantom male was leaning on its phantom sword, and the blood seemed trickling fast from the ruffles, from the lace, and the darkness of the intermediate shadow swallowed them up. They were gone. And again the bubbles of light shot and sailed and undulated, growing thicker and thicker and more wildly confused in their movements. The closet door to the right of the fireplace now opened, and from the aperture there came the form of an aged woman. In her hand, she held letters, the very letters over which I had seen the hand close, and behind her I heard a footstep. She turned round as if to listen, and then she opened the letters and seemed to read. And over her shoulder I saw a livid face, the face as of a man long drowned, bloated, bleached, seaweed tangled in its dripping hair, and at her feet lay a form as a corpse, and beside the corpse there cowered a child, a miserable, squalid child, with famine in its cheeks and fear in its eyes. And as I looked in the old woman's face, the wrinkles and lines vanished, and it became a face of youth, hard-eyed, stony, but still youth. And the shadow darted forth, and the darkness over these phantoms, as it had darkened over the last. Nothing now was left but the shadow, and on that my eyes were intently fixed, till again eyes grew out of the shadow, malignant, serpent eyes, and the bubbles of light again rose and fell, and in their disordered, irregular, turbulent maze mingled with the wan moonlight. And now from these globules themselves, as are from the shell of an egg, monstrous things burst out. The air grew filled with them, larvae so bloodless and so hideous I can in no way describe them, except to remind the listener of the swarming life which the solar microscope brings forth before the eyes in drops of water. Things transparent, supple, agile, chasing each other, devouring each other. Forms like not ought to have been held by the naked eye. As the shapes were without symmetry, so their movements were without order. In their very vagrancies, there was no sport. They came round me and round, thicker and faster and swifter, swarming over my head, crawling over my right arm, which was outstretched in involuntary command against all evil beings. Sometimes I felt myself touched, but not by them. Invisible hands touched me. Once I felt the clutch as cold, soft fingers at my throat. I was still equally conscious that if I gave way to fear, I should be in bodily peril, and I concentrated all of my faculties in the single focus of resisting stubborn will. And I turned my sight from the shadow, above all, from those strange serpent eyes that had now become distinctly visible. For there, though in naught else around me, I was aware there was a will, and a will of intense, creative, working evil, which might crush down my own. The pale atmosphere in the room now began to redden, as if in the air of some near fire. The larvae grew lurid as things that live in fire. Again, the room vibrated. Again were heard the 3 measured knocks, and again all things were swallowed up in the darkness of the dark shadow. As if out of the darkness all had come, and into the darkness all returned. And that is the end of a very creepy part 2 of The Haunted and the Haunters. We will conclude the story next week on Friday, February 3rd. So be sure to follow the show wherever you listen so you know when that new episode comes out. For information about our ghost tours, paranormal investigations, and online experiences, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter for the latest news and updates. As always, a special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. If you are enjoying our episodes, we hope you will leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.